While cleaning out the basement after my husband's death, I found a sealed envelope. Inside, a key and an address. The note read, "Come alone. This is important for your future." When I arrived and opened the door, my life turned upside down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Frank and I had been married for 31 years when he died. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest. 31 years of Saturday morning pancakes, of arguments about the thermostat, of holding hands during thunderstorms because he knew I was still, after all those decades, a little afraid of thunder. 31 years of a man who called me Ellie Bird and meant it every single time. He passed on a Tuesday in October. A heart attack, quiet and sudden. The way the doctors say is merciful. I'm not sure mercy is the right word for something that leaves you standing in a hospital corridor at 6 a.m., still holding the crossword puzzle you brought to pass the time, suddenly understanding that no amount of time will ever need passing again in quite the same way. Frank had been married once before, briefly, in his 30s. That marriage had produced one son, Dennis. Dennis Marsh was 52 years old, lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, and had visited us exactly 4 times in 11 years. He always arrived with his wife Cheryl, a thin, watchful woman with the smile of someone who has practiced it in a mirror, and he always left with Frank looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I never asked Frank about it directly. I suppose I should have. But there are silences in a long marriage that you learn to respect, and the subject of Dennis was one of them. Frank would squeeze my hand after those visits and say, "You're the family I chose, Ellie Bird." And I believed him. I still believe him. But belief, I've learned, is not the same as knowing. The weeks after the funeral passed in that strange cotton wool way of grief. Muffled, slow, everything slightly wrong. Dennis and Cheryl came for the service, stayed 2 days, and left. Cheryl hugged me at the airport and said, "Let us know if you need anything," in the tone people use when they are confident you won't. It was November when I finally went down to the basement. I had been putting it off. The basement was Frank's domain. His workbench, his fishing gear, shelves of paint cans and old tax records, and the kind of accumulated life debris that a man collects over 3 decades. I told myself I was giving it time. The truth is, I wasn't ready to touch his things. Every object down there still belonged to him in some way I couldn't articulate. But the furnace needed servicing, and the serviceman needed access, so down I went on a gray Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee and a determination to at least clear a path. I found the envelope behind a false panel in the back of the lowest shelf. I wouldn't have found it at all if I hadn't knocked over a stack of old paint cans reaching for a bag of rock salt. The panel, a thin sheet of plywood painted to match the shelf, swung loose, and there it was. A manila envelope, sealed with tape, with my name written on it in Frank's handwriting. Eleanor. Not Ellie Bird. Eleanor. His formal hand, the one he used for important things. I sat down on the cold concrete floor right there and then because my legs made the decision before my brain did. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. The basement smelled like sawdust and motor oil and Frank, and I sat in that smell and tried to breathe. Inside the envelope, I found 2 things: a key on a plain metal ring and a folded index card. On the card, in that same careful handwriting, were a street address, a storage facility on the east side of Portland, a place I'd never heard of, and 9 words. "Come alone. This is important for your future." I read those 9 words 4 times. Come alone. Why alone? Who would I bring? And why had my husband of 31 years hidden a key and an address behind a false panel in our basement, with instructions that felt less like a love note and more like a warning? I set the card down on the workbench beside my coffee cup, which had gone cold. I looked at the key. Small, brass, the kind that opens a padlock. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of key that could open anything or nothing. What had Frank been protecting, and from whom? The furnace serviceman knocked at the door at that moment, and I startled so badly I knocked over my coffee. I shoved the envelope, the key, and the card into the pocket of my cardigan and went upstairs on unsteady legs. I didn't call Dennis. Not yet. Something, instinct, or perhaps 31 years of learning to read the silences, told me that was exactly what Frank had not wanted me to do. I drove to the address the next morning. I almost didn't go. I spent that entire night sitting at the kitchen table with the key in front of me, drinking tea I didn't taste, cycling through every reasonable explanation I could construct. A surprise gift, perhaps. Frank had always been thoughtful about anniversaries, an investment he'd been managing quietly, old papers he wanted me to have. I built and dismantled these theories until 3 a.m., when I finally admitted to myself that none of them required the words "come alone." The storage facility was a low concrete building on a commercial strip east of the river, surrounded by a chain-link fence and the kind of sodium vapor lighting that makes everything look like evidence. I arrived at 9 in the morning when the office opened. The young man at the desk confirmed that a unit had been rented under Frank's name. Rented, I learned, for 11 years. And that he had listed me as an authorized secondary access holder. He gave me the unit number without any fuss. Unit 14. Ground floor, end of the row. I walked down the corridor alone, as instructed. The key fit the padlock exactly. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before I could make myself step inside. The unit was approximately 12 feet square. It was clean, climate-controlled, and organized with the same methodical precision that Frank had applied to everything in his life. Along the left wall, a row of banker's boxes, labeled by year going back 15 years. Against the right wall, 2 filing cabinets, both locked. In the center, a folding table with a single item on it, a letter-sized envelope, unsealed, with my name on it again. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter, 6 pages front and back in Frank's familiar script, and a small notebook. I will not reproduce the entire letter here. Some of it is still too private, but the essential truth of it was this. Before Frank met me, before his first marriage even, he had been the co-founder of a small technology company in Seattle. In 1987, that company had developed a proprietary software system that they had subsequently sold. The sale had been contentious. Frank had believed for decades that his co-founder, a man named Gerald Bates, had manipulated the valuation and structured the deal in a way that had cost Frank a significant share of what he was legitimately owed. Frank had kept records, meticulous, obsessive, detailed records, correspondence, financial documents, internal memos, his own contemporaneous notes. Everything was in the banker's boxes. But the letter was not really about Gerald Bates. The letter was about Dennis. In the year before Frank's death, Dennis had reconnected with Gerald Bates. Frank had found out how. The letter did not say in detail, only that he had confirmed it through a reliable source. Dennis and Gerald had been in communication for at least 8 months. Frank believed they had been discussing the original sale, the records Frank had kept, and what those records might be worth, or what it might be worth to certain parties to ensure those records were never presented to anyone. "I don't know what Dennis told him about me," Frank had written. "I don't know what he was promised. But I know my son, Eleanor. I know what he's capable of when he believes there's something to gain. I kept these records because I always intended someday to seek a proper accounting. I'm giving them to you because I trust you to know what to do with them. Dennis must not have access to this unit or its contents. Promise me, Ellie Bird." He had used the name at the end. Ellie Bird. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time. The grief was still there. It never leaves. It just shifts. But beside it now was something new. Something cold and clear and not quite anger, not quite fear. Something that required a name I didn't have yet. I thought about Cheryl's practiced smile at the airport. "Let us know if you need anything." I thought about the 4 visits in 11 years. Frank's tired eyes afterward. I thought about 11 years of a padlock on a storage unit and a husband who had built a false panel in his own basement because he did not feel safe leaving the key anywhere visible. What kind of man hides things from his own son? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was a man who knows exactly what his son is. I locked the unit. I drove home. I made a list. The list was not long, but it was precise. First, I needed a lawyer. Not the family attorney who had handled Frank's estate, who Dennis already knew, but someone new. Someone with no prior connection to our family. Second, I needed to understand what exactly was in those banker's boxes. What Frank believed he was owed, and whether any of it was still legally actionable. Third, I needed to do all of this before Dennis had any reason to suspect I had found anything. The clock, I realized, had already been running. I just hadn't known it until now. Was I frightened? Yes. I was 71 years old, recently widowed, and sitting on what might be a significant legal and financial matter involving a stepson I barely knew and a business dispute going back decades. I had every reason to be frightened. But Frank had written your future, not our past. My future. He had been thinking of me right up until the end, and I was not going to let that go to waste. I found Margaret Chen through the Oregon State Bar's referral service. I had been deliberate about it. I wanted someone with a background in both estate law and business litigation, someone who had no existing relationship with Frank's estate, and someone who was not the kind of attorney who pats elderly women on the hand and suggests they leave the complicated parts to others. Margaret Chen, 58, partner at a mid-sized firm on the west side of Portland, came with 3 strong referrals and a reputation for what one reviewer described as tenacious and unsentimental. That sounded exactly right. I called her office on a Thursday, made an appointment for the following Monday, and said nothing to anyone in the interim. That weekend, Dennis called. It was the first time he had called since a brief condolence call, 2 weeks after the funeral. His voice had its usual quality. Not quite warm, not quite cold. Calibrated somewhere in the middle like a thermostat, set to a temperature no one actually finds comfortable. "Just checking in, Eleanor. Wanted to make sure you're managing everything all right." "I'm managing fine, Dennis, thank you. Dad's estate. It's all been settled. The basic probate process is proceeding normally," I said, which was true and revealed nothing. These things take time. "Of course." A pause. "If there's anything you need help with, paperwork, going through his things, Cheryl and I are happy to come up." Cheryl and I. The unit of threat, I had begun to think of them. "That's very kind," I said. "I'll let you know." After I hung up, I stood by the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, Frank's garden, now November brown, and thought about timing. Dennis had not called for weeks. He called now. Was that coincidence? Or had someone, Bates, perhaps, or someone connected to Bates, flagged Frank's death in some legal or financial context that had sent a quiet signal? I didn't know, but I noted it. Margaret Chen's office was on the 14th floor of a building that looked west toward the hills. She had the kind of stillness that comes from having listened to a great many people tell her their worst problems. I sat across from her conference table and told her everything: the basement, the envelope, the storage unit, the letter, Frank's account of Gerald Bates and Dennis. I laid the small notebook on the table between us. I had not yet opened it. I'd been saving that for a witness. She read the notebook in silence while I looked out the window at the hills. It took her 20 minutes. When she looked up, her expression had not changed exactly, but something behind her eyes had sharpened. "Your husband kept very good records," she said. "He was an engineer," I said. "He kept records of everything." "Mrs. Marsh, what's in this notebook, and presumably in the boxes at the storage unit, constitutes potential evidence in a civil action for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud in the structuring of a business sale. The statute of limitations on most of this would have run out years ago." She paused. "However, if there's evidence of active concealment, and your husband's notes suggest there may be, the limitations clock can be told. That's a legal complexity we'd need to examine carefully." "And Dennis?" I asked. She set the notebook down. "If your husband's account is accurate, that Dennis was in communication with Gerald Bates about these records, then Dennis may have been engaged in conduct that could constitute interference with your husband's estate. Potentially more, depending on what we find in those boxes." She asked to see the boxes. We went to the storage unit together that afternoon. Margaret moved through the banker's boxes with the systematic efficiency of someone who does not waste time on emotions. 3 hours in, she stopped at a box labeled 2009 to 2011 and removed a folder. Inside was a copy of a letter. Frank's copy, his handwritten date in the corner, addressed to Gerald Bates, and clipped to it a printed email chain dated 8 months before Frank's death, between an address I didn't recognize and an address that ended in @geralderbates.com. The email chain had been forwarded to Frank by his reliable source. In it, Dennis had written, in his own name, his own email address, no ambiguity, asking Bates whether the old man's files could be neutralized before probate became an issue. Neutralized. My hands were steady when I held that printout. I had expected something. I had told myself I was prepared. And yet seeing my stepson's name, his words, his cold arithmetic applied to his own father's legacy, it was different from expecting it. It was the difference between knowing a storm is coming and standing in the rain. Margaret Chen looked at me carefully. "Mrs. Marsh, are you all right?" "I'm quite all right," I said. And I meant it, because this was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. And facts, unlike suspicions, can be used. The plan, as Margaret and I had developed it, was methodical. The first step was a complete inventory and imaging of everything in the storage unit, every document, every folder, every page of Frank's notes, uploaded to a secure server at Margaret's firm and backed up in 2 additional locations. The second step was a formal legal assessment of the claims, what was still actionable, what wasn't, and what we could realistically pursue. The third step, when the time was right, would be a letter, a very specific, very carefully worded letter, to Gerald Bates's attorney. We had completed steps 1 and 2. We were 10 days from sending the letter. Dennis and Cheryl arrived at my door on a Saturday morning without warning. I saw Cheryl's rental car in the driveway through the kitchen window and felt the cold clarity I had been cultivating over the past weeks crystallize into something almost calm. I dried my hands on the dish towel, straightened my cardigan, and opened the door. "Dennis, Cheryl, this is unexpected." Dennis had Frank's height, but not his stillness. He was a man made of nervous energy, badly controlled, jaw tight, smile too quick. "We were worried about you, Eleanor. You've seemed distant on the phone." "I've been busy," I said. "Come in." We sat in the living room with coffee I poured, because that is what a woman of my generation does. And for 20 minutes, we talked about nothing. The weather, Cheryl's sister's new house, the drive up from the airport. I watched Dennis's eyes move around the room, cataloging, assessing. It was Cheryl who broke first, which I had expected. She had the kind of impatience that disguises itself as concern. Eleanor, we wanted to talk to you about Frank's estate. There are some business matters, things connected to his past, that we think you may not be fully aware of. We'd hate for you to make decisions based on incomplete information. What kind of matters? I asked. Dennis leaned forward. Dad had some old business dealings that were complicated, unresolved. There are people who might try to use his papers, if they exist, to pursue claims that are long past their legal sell-by date. Claims that could drag you into litigation, cost you money, create stress you don't need. How kind of you to think of my stress, I said. His smile tightened. Eleanor, we're family. We're trying to help you. Dennis, I said, setting down my coffee cup with a steadiness that surprised even me. I appreciate you making the trip, but I have an attorney, and I am managing Frank's affairs appropriately. If there are legal matters you feel you have a stake in, I'd suggest you have your own attorney contact mine. The silence that followed had a texture. Cheryl's voice, when she spoke, had lost the warmth entirely. That's a very lawyerly thing to say, Eleanor. I've been spending time with lawyers, I said pleasantly. They left an hour later. But before Dennis reached the door, he turned, and his face was different. Stripped of the performance, just the thing underneath it. You have no idea what you're getting into, he said. There are people involved in this who don't appreciate interference. I'm asking you, for your own good, to leave this alone. Was that a threat? I believe it was a threat. Thank you for coming, I said and closed the door. I stood with my back against the door for a moment. Then I called Margaret and told her what had happened. She called it expected escalation and adjusted some timelines. Then she said, Mrs. Marsh, I want you to take the next few days. Don't make calls. Don't access the unit. Don't make any visible moves. Let them think you're reconsidering. It was good advice. I spent 4 days in Frank's garden, pulling out the dead growth of the season, turning soil, making space for spring. I thought about him. I thought about 31 years and about the word future, and about what it means to be trusted by someone who is no longer here to see whether you earned it. I came back to the work on Thursday, steadier than I'd been before. The offer arrived on a Tuesday. Not in person this time. By certified mail, through an attorney in Scottsdale I had never heard of. It was phrased with great legal delicacy. The substance was this: Dennis, acting through his attorney, was proposing a full and final settlement of any and all claims related to the estate of Francis Harold Marsh, in exchange for my agreement to refrain from pursuing, initiating, or supporting any legal action related to business transactions predating the marriage of Francis Marsh and Eleanor Marsh, and to surrender or destroy any documents or records related to same. The settlement figure offered was $200,000. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen table. I made tea. $200,000 is not a small amount of money, particularly for a retired school teacher living on a pension and modest savings. I will not pretend the number meant nothing. I sat with it for a full hour, letting it sit in the room the way you let a piece of furniture sit before you decide whether it belongs. Then I thought about the word surrender. Then I thought about the word destroy. These were not the words of a man with a clean conscience. These were not the words of someone who believed the other side's claims had no merit. A man who is confident the records are worthless does not pay $200,000 to have them destroyed. I called Margaret. It's an admission, she said, before I'd finished describing the letter. Not legally binding as one, but strategically. Yes, they're scared. What do I do? you decline, politely, formally, through me. And then we send our letter to Bates's attorney, as planned. I declined the offer, but I will tell you something I haven't told anyone. In the days that followed, I felt the solitude of what I was doing more acutely than at any other point. I was 71 years old. I had no children. Frank and I had tried, and it hadn't happened, and we'd made our peace with that long ago. My sister Ruth lived in Albuquerque. We spoke on Sundays. My closest local friend, Diane, was the woman I had taught alongside for 12 years before we both retired. She was sharp, discreet, and had buried a husband of her own. I called Diane on a Wednesday evening and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is the highest form of friendship. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need someone who knows," I said. "In case anything happens. In case I lose my nerve at 3 in the morning and need to be reminded why I'm doing this." "I can do that," she said. "And Eleanor, Frank wasn't wrong about you." I didn't ask her to explain. I already knew. In the weeks that followed, Diane came to dinner twice a week. She didn't ask for updates unless I offered them. She brought wine and talked about other things: her grandchildren, a book she was reading, the absurdity of the weather. She made the world feel inhabited again, not just by grief and strategy, but by ordinary warmth. Dennis and Cheryl, I knew, were watching. Margaret had received a call from the Scottsdale attorney, probing for information, gauging our position. They were recalibrating. They had offered money, and I had refused it, and they were trying to understand what kind of woman refuses money. The kind, I thought, who was taught by 31 years with a careful man that some things are worth more than their price. They came back in January. This time, Cheryl called first. 2 days' notice, a carefully pleasant voice, an offer to clear the air. I told her they were welcome for dinner on Friday. I told Diane, who offered to be present. I declined, but I told her the date and asked her to call me Saturday morning. I cooked a simple meal, roast chicken, the kind Frank had liked. I set the table properly, with the good plates, the linen napkins I hadn't used since Thanksgiving, the candlesticks Frank's mother had left us. If this was theater, I intended to perform it correctly. There is a particular kind of dignity in preparation, in refusing to let the enemy find you underdressed. Dennis arrived, seeming softer than he had in November. Cheryl had dressed more casually, less armored. No jewelry except small gold earrings, a sweater in a warm, unthreatening color. These were choices. I noticed them the way I notice when a student has tried too hard to look as though they haven't studied. The costume of approachability is still a costume. Over dinner, they were almost pleasant. Dennis mentioned growing up, a memory of Frank teaching him to fish on a lake in Washington, the summer he was 9. He described it with what seemed like genuine affection, the color of the water, Frank's patience with a boy who kept tangling his line. I listened. I did not allow myself to be moved, but I noted that even people who have done wrong things contain real memories. That's what makes them complicated. That's what makes the wrong things worse. Cheryl asked about my plans for the garden in spring. She had apparently done some research. She mentioned dahlias by name, asked whether I planned to winter the bulbs over or start fresh. It was the kind of specific knowledge that signals effort. She had prepared this conversation. I gave her credit for it and trusted her not at all. It was after dessert, over decaf, that the structure of the evening revealed itself. "Eleanor," Dennis said, "we've been doing some soul-searching since November. We think we came on too strong. We were worried, and worry made us clumsy." "I understand," I said, which was not the same as agreeing. "The thing is, and I want you to understand this comes from a place of genuine concern, what you're doing could hurt a lot of people. Not just Bates, not just our family. There are investors from that original deal who are still alive. There are children of people involved. It's not as simple as a dispute between two men from 40 years ago. There are ripples. There are always ripples, I said. Cheryl leaned forward. Her voice dropped to the register of intimacy. We know you miss Frank, Eleanor. We know how much you loved him. But sometimes the people we love keep secrets because they're protecting us. Maybe Frank put you in this position without realizing what it would cost you. Wouldn't it be more faithful to his memory to let it rest? To protect the peace he never had? I looked at her for a long moment. I let the silence sit. It was a beautiful manipulation. It used grief and love and the language of loyalty. It attempted to transform my pursuit of Frank's wishes into a betrayal of Frank's spirit. It tried to reframe my faithfulness as selfishness and his secrecy as tenderness rather than strategic necessity. It was, technically, almost elegant. Cheryl was more intelligent than I had initially given her credit for, and I recalibrated accordingly. Frank's memory, I said, told me specifically what he wanted in his own handwriting, 6 pages of it. I think I'll trust that over an interpretation offered by someone who visited him 4 times in 11 years. The silence that followed was of a different quality than November's. This was not the silence of recalibration. This was the silence of something breaking, a careful structure collapsing under the weight of its own artifice. Dennis stood up. The soft performance was gone completely, shed like a coat on a warm day, and what was underneath it was not pretty. You're making a very serious mistake, he said. You're an old woman acting alone on bad legal advice, stirring up a 40-year-old story that nobody wants to hear. You'll spend your savings on lawyers and get nothing. Nothing. And when you're sitting in that house alone with an empty bank account wondering what happened, don't say no one warned you. Thank you for dinner, Cheryl said, and her voice was flat and bright, the way ice looks when it's thin over deep water. Something hard beneath something that catches the light. They left. I cleared the table. I washed the good plates and dried them and put them back in the cabinet where they belonged. I folded the linen napkins. And yes, I was frightened. I will not pretend otherwise. Dennis's face when the performance had slipped was a face I had not seen before, and what it contained was not anger exactly, but something colder. Contempt. The assumption that I was a problem to be managed, and that I had failed to cooperate with my own management. That contempt, I decided, was useful information. A man who respects you will negotiate. A man who only simulates respect until it's inconvenient shows you, in that moment, exactly what you're actually dealing with. I filed that away. I would need it. But here is what I've learned about fear at 71. It is not the opposite of courage. It's the proof of it. You are not brave when you feel nothing. You are brave when you feel everything, and you fold the dish towel and hang it on the rack, and you go to bed, knowing tomorrow you will get up and continue. I called Margaret at 8 the next morning and told her to proceed with the letter. The letter to Gerald Bates's attorney went out on January 17th. It was 43 pages, not counting exhibits. Margaret had been thorough in the way that only someone who genuinely enjoys a complex problem can be thorough. Not just comprehensive, but elegant. Each argument building on the last with the precision of something constructed rather than assembled. The core claim was breach of fiduciary duty in the structuring of the 1987 sale, supported by Frank's contemporaneous documentation showing that Bates had withheld material information from Frank during negotiations. The active concealment argument, which potentially told the statute of limitations, was grounded in evidence that Bates had, for decades, maintained through intermediaries a deliberate effort to suppress Frank's records. The email chain in which Dennis asked about neutralizing Frank's files was Exhibit 14. The response from Bates's side came within 10 days, and it was not conciliatory. Bates had retained a large Seattle litigation firm. The counter letter accused Frank's estate of harassment, challenged the authenticity of the documents, and contained a thinly veiled threat of sanctions. It also, critically, denied any knowledge of Dennis Marsh. That denial was stated flatly, without qualification. A mistake, as it turned out, because flat denials leave no room for graceful retreat. That denial became important 17 days later, when Margaret obtained, through a subpoena in the preliminary filing, phone records showing 14 calls between Dennis's cell phone and Bates's personal line in the 6 months before Frank's death. 14 calls, some of them long, the longest placed in September, 1 month before Frank died, lasting 47 minutes. The hearing was on a Thursday in February, in a conference room at a mediator's office in downtown Portland. It was not a trial. We were at the stage of a preliminary mediation required by Oregon civil procedure before full litigation could proceed. But it was the first time that all parties were in the same room, and first times have their own gravity. I had slept well the night before, which surprised me. I had expected insomnia, the rehearsal anxiety of a woman who had built towards something for months and was now required to sit in a room and be steady, while strangers decided what it was worth. But I slept. I woke at 6, made coffee, sat in Frank's chair by the window and watched the February light come up over the garden. It was enough. Bates was 79, smaller than I had imagined from Frank's descriptions. He arrived with 2 attorneys and did not look at me. Dennis and Cheryl arrived separately, with the Scottsdale attorney and a second lawyer I didn't recognize, a younger man in an expensive suit who had the slightly hunted look of someone who had been brought in late and not fully briefed. They looked at me briefly and looked away. Margaret and I sat together on our side of the table. I had worn Frank's favorite cardigan of mine. A deep blue one, he always said, matched my eyes. I'm not sure why that mattered. It mattered. Margaret laid out our position systematically. The documentation, the financial analysis, the active concealment argument, the phone records. She was precise and unhurried, and she never raised her voice. Not because she was restrained, but because she didn't need to. The documents spoke at a volume that rendered performance unnecessary. There is a particular kind of authority in someone who doesn't need to perform authority, and Margaret had it completely. When Bates's lead attorney began his response, opening with challenges to document authenticity, citing the age of the records, questioning chain of custody, Margaret quietly slid a folder across the table. Inside was a notarized declaration from a forensic document examiner who had authenticated every page of Frank's records. 8 days of examination. 31 pages of findings. The attorney paused mid-sentence. The younger attorney in the expensive suit wrote something on his legal pad. I could not read it from across the table. I watched his face instead, and his face said, "We were not told about this." It was Dennis, not Bates, who lost control first. He leaned forward and said, loudly enough that the mediator's assistant looked up from her notes, "This is extortion. This is a senile old woman who has been manipulated by a lawyer into dredging up nonsense that no court is going to touch. My father would be appalled by this. He would be appalled. Mr. Marsh." The mediator's voice was level and complete. "You are not a party of record in this proceeding. You will either sit quietly, or you will be asked to leave." The word senile sat in the room. I watched every face in it respond to that word. I watched the Scottsdale attorney close his eyes briefly, the expression of a man whose client has just handed the other side a gift. I watched one of Bates's attorneys write something on his legal pad and turn it slightly so his colleague could read it. I watched the mediator's assistant mark something in her notes with a small, deliberate underline. And I watched my own hands, folded on the table, perfectly still. 71 years old, recently widowed, sitting in a room of men who had various investments in my silence, and my hands were perfectly still. Cheryl put her hand on Dennis's arm. He shook it off. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it landed in the room with significance. The unified front, already under strain, was showing its seams. "Mr. Bates," Margaret said calmly, redirecting with the ease of someone who is prepared for every possible disruption. "Would your client care to explain the 14 phone calls with Mr. Dennis Marsh between March and October of last year? Given that your previous correspondence stated he had no knowledge of Mr. Marsh." Bates's lead attorney whispered something. Bates stared at the table. His hands, I noticed, were pressed flat against the surface, the hands of someone steadying himself. He was an old man who had carried something for a very long time, and the weight of it was finally, visibly, showing. "We'd like a recess," the attorney said. We took a 15-minute recess. During it, Margaret and I stood by the window looking out at the February rain on the city, gray and persistent, the kind of Portland rain that isn't dramatic, just continuous. And she said, very quietly, "They're going to settle." "You're sure?" "They've lost the concealment defense. The phone records directly contradict their written denial. That's a serious problem, potentially sanctionable. The forensic authentication removed their only evidentiary challenge. If this goes to full litigation, discovery will be brutal for both of them, and they know it." She paused, looking at the rain. "Frank built a good case, Eleanor. Over 30 years. He just never had the chance to use it." I thought about that. About 30 years of a man carrying something quietly, carefully, in bankers' boxes behind a locked door, waiting for a moment that never came for him but had come unexpectedly for me. "Then we settle on our terms," I said. "Yes," she said, "we do." When we returned to the table, the dynamic in the room had shifted in the tangible way that rooms shift when something decisive has occurred in their absence. Bates's lead attorney asked to schedule a follow-up session. The younger attorney in the expensive suit was already packing his bag. Dennis did not look at me when we filed out. I did not require him to. The settlement negotiation took 6 weeks. There were 3 rounds of offers. The first 2 were inadequate, structured in ways that would have limited future claims or imposed confidentiality conditions that Margaret found unacceptable, or that routed payment through mechanisms that would have reduced the net recovery after fees. We declined both. Each decline was followed by a period of silence from the other side, a day, 2 days, that I read as the silence of people doing arithmetic and not liking the results. By the 3rd round, something had shifted on the other side that went beyond numbers. Bates's firm had begun filing responsive motions that suggested they were no longer coordinating with Dennis's attorneys. The language of the filings had diverged in small but telling ways. The alliance, such as it had been, was fracturing under the weight of their conflicting interests. Bates's primary concern was limiting his own exposure. Dennis's was something murkier, more personal. Those are different problems, and they do not negotiate well together. The Scottsdale attorney filed a motion to withdraw from the case in the 5th week. Margaret told me this on a Tuesday evening. I was in the garden when she called, pulling dead growth from the rose bed. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means Dennis can no longer afford him," she said, "or no longer trusts him. Either way, he's operating with reduced legal support at exactly the wrong moment." A pause. It's over, Eleanor. They know it too. The final settlement was signed on March 15th. I won't give you the exact figure. Not for modesty, but because the number itself is less important than what it represented and how it arrived. I will say that it was, in Margaret's measured assessment, full and fair compensation for what was taken, with interest for the period of concealment. It acknowledged, without the word fraud, but with language that was its legal equivalent, language that any attorney reading it would recognize immediately for what it was, that Frank's original equity position had been materially misrepresented during the 1987 sale. The settlement amount reflected not merely the original discrepancy, but 3.5 decades of what that equity would have become. The funds were paid into Frank's estate, which meant they would pass according to his will. To me, with a portion directed to the scholarship fund Frank had established years ago at his alma mater in Seattle. He had set that fund up quietly, years before his death, with a modest initial endowment. He had never mentioned it to me. I found it in the estate documents the first week after he died, and I had wept over it then for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. Something about the privacy of a person's generosity, the things people do when no one is watching. Now it would be funded properly. That felt right. That felt like Frank. Gerald Bates issued no public statement. He was 79 and unwell. And I believe I have no evidence for this, only the intuition of a woman who has watched a great many people carry things they shouldn't, that he had kept that old injustice in some uncomfortable corner of himself for a long time. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like unfinished business that had quietly shaped the architecture of his years. I did not feel triumphant about him. I felt that a ledger had been corrected, and that somewhere, in whatever way the dead remain present to those who loved them, Frank knew it. Dennis was a different matter. When it emerged, as it did emerge, through the discovery filings that became part of the public record, available to anyone who thought to look, that Dennis had been in deliberate communication with Bates specifically to undermine his own father's potential claims, the consequences were significant, swift, and, I confess, not entirely unwelcome. First, professionally. Dennis worked as a business consultant, and his practice had been built on the commodity of trust, the belief by his clients that he was on their side and would remain there. The revelation of his conduct, documented and on the public record, cost him 2 major clients within a month. A third followed 6 weeks later, after a brief and apparently unsuccessful attempt to explain away what the filings showed. Word travels in business communities faster than people expect, particularly in the connected world of Southwestern consulting networks. A man who plotted against his own father's estate to protect a business associate's 30-year-old fraud is not a man you want managing your vulnerabilities. Second, legally, Margaret had filed a separate ethics complaint with the Oregon State Bar regarding the conduct of the Scottsdale attorney, specifically his role in communications that had occurred while Dennis was technically a potential party in the estate proceedings. That investigation was ongoing at the time of the settlement and remained so afterward. I did not track its outcome closely. Some things you have to release. Third, within the family. Frank had a younger brother, Harold, who lived in Vermont and whom I had always genuinely liked. A quieter version of Frank, with the same careful hands and the same habit of thinking before speaking. Harold called me the week after the settlement became public. We talked for an hour. He did not defend Dennis. He did not perform discomfort or issue diplomatic non-statements. He said simply and directly, "Frank always worried about that boy, Eleanor, right from the start. I'm sorry it took this to bring it into the light, and I'm sorry you were the one who had to do it." And Frank trusted me to, I said. He was right to, Harold said. And then, he was always right about you. There was no reconciliation scene with Dennis. No tearful confrontation in a diner, no admission delivered in a parking lot, no apology that I would have had to decide what to do with. He sent a one-line email through his remaining attorney stating that he wished to have no further contact. That was acceptable to me. More than acceptable. A clean line is easier to live with than a complicated one. Cheryl, I heard through Harold some months later, had suggested they sell the Scottsdale house and move. Whether she meant move together or separately was not entirely clear in the telling. Harold said it with the careful neutrality of a man who had his suspicions and saw no reason to voice them. The last thing I did before I considered that chapter closed was return to the storage unit one final time. I went alone, as Frank had asked. I stood in the middle of the unit, surrounded by the banker's boxes that had been returned after imaging. They were mine now, to keep or dispose of as I chose. And I read the last paragraph of Frank's letter again. The part I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Margaret. Not even Diane. I know this is a lot to ask of you, Ellie Bird. I know you came into my life to have a quiet life together, not to fight old battles. But I watched you teach for 20 years. I watched you handle things I couldn't have handled. I know who you are better than you sometimes do. You'll know what to do. You always have. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases. I put it in my pocket, close to my chest, where it would travel home with me. I turned off the light. I closed the padlock. I walked out into the March air, which smelled like rain and something opening. I drove home. I made tea. I sat in Frank's chair, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the future as something that belonged to me. Spring came. I planted Frank's garden. Really planted it, the way it deserved. Not just the dutiful maintenance of grief, but the active work of someone who has decided the world will continue to be beautiful. I put in dahlias and late-season tulips and a climbing rose along the back fence that Frank had always wanted but we'd never gotten around to. The scholarship fund received its first endowment that April. It was for students studying engineering at Frank's University, with a preference given to first-generation college students. I attended the small ceremony. I met a young woman named Priya, who was finishing her junior year, precise and hungry and bright, and who reminded me a little of the person I used to be before I learned to make myself smaller to fit in rooms where women were expected to. I told her she was going to be extraordinary. She said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Because you remind me of someone I trust." Diane and I began traveling. Nothing extravagant. A week in Savannah, a long weekend in Victoria, a trip to New Mexico to see Ruth. We went to museums and ate good meals and argued about books. I had forgotten how much I liked arguing about books. Margaret Chen and I had lunch twice a year. She had become, in the way that certain professional relationships do, a friend of a particular kind, not intimate, but reliable and real. She told me once that my case had been one of the most satisfying of her career. I told her Frank deserved most of the credit. She said, "He did the collecting, you did the courage." I didn't argue. What happened to Dennis and Cheryl? I know some of it through Harold, who maintained distant contact with his nephew and reported back with the mild sadness of someone watching a slow-motion consequence unfold. The client losses were substantial. Dennis had built his consulting practice on reputation, and reputation, once punctured, deflates in ways that are hard to reverse. By the following year, he had closed his firm and was working, Harold gathered, in some diminished capacity for a former associate. The house in Scottsdale, which had been, I gathered, somewhat beyond their means, was sold. Cheryl left. Harold told me this with evident discomfort, expecting perhaps that I would feel something complicated. I felt only the flat recognition of pattern. A marriage built partly on shared appetite tends not to survive the removal of the thing being sought. That is not my cruelty speaking. That is simply how it goes. Gerald Bates died in November of that year, 6 months after the settlement. I read the obituary in a Seattle paper online. It was respectful and said nothing about us. I sat with it for a moment. This man who had been a ghost in my life without my knowing it. And then I closed the browser and went to water the roses. As for me, what can I tell you about being 72 years old with an unexpected future? It is quieter than I expected, and fuller. I missed Frank every day, and continued to. Missing is not the same as being stopped. I learned to carry the missing the way you learn to carry anything heavy, with your whole body, with rest when you need it, without pretending it isn't there. I started teaching again, in a small way, a literacy program on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the public library. Adults learning to read, some of them, others brushing up their English as newcomers to the country. It was nothing grand. It was exactly the right size. I was, in all the ways that matter, happy. Not the simple happiness of before, when I didn't know what the basement contained. A harder happiness, a built happiness, the kind that knows what it cost and doesn't look away. Frank used to say that secrets don't protect the people who keep them. They protect the people they're kept from. He was right, though it took me a basement and a false panel and a year of the hardest work of my life to fully understand it. What I learned is this: at any age, you are not finished. A locked door is not a wall, and the person you discover yourself to be in a crisis is the person you always were. You simply hadn't met her yet under those conditions. I met myself at 71 in a storage unit in Portland, Oregon, holding a key my husband had trusted me to use. I would do it again, every day of it. So I want to ask you, if you found that envelope, if someone you loved left you something difficult and important and asked you to be brave with it, what would you do? Think about it. I believe you already know the answer. Thank you for listening to Eleanor's story. If something in it stayed with you, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what it was. And if you believe someone else needs to hear it, share it. Stories like this are only useful if they travel.